Hello, listeners. This is Janine
and Kristen
from Henrico Casa. You are listening to our podcast, Vigilant Voices. Living life every day. Hello, listeners. We hope you're continuing to enjoy the start of a new year.
Yeah, this year is off to a good start for us at CASA because we have a new class of advocates in training right now. Yes, we so appreciate their willingness to step up and share their time with children in our community.
And these are children, as a reminder, listeners, who truly need a safe adult in their life.
Yeah.
And so these new advocates are going through training because, just like we always say on this podcast, when we know more about the challenges facing children and families, we can ensure that no child faces continued abuse or neglect this year.
So true. And these children that we serve at CASA are all different. Mm-hmm. They have unique personalities, unique needs, and family dynamics, all the things. But the one thing that they all have in common is that they have experienced ACEs.
And ACEs stand for Adverse Childhood Experiences.
Right.
Which sounds jarring, but what we're probably going to talk a little bit about is that many of you listeners may have also experienced ACEs.
Right. Many of all of us. Mm-hmm. And also a little boy that we served last year that we wanted to tell you about in today's CASA case story. We're going to call him Ryan. But he's had a lot of these ACEs, or again, adverse childhood experiences in his story so far. Both of his parents have been incarcerated at various times. His mother has a mental illness that significantly impacts, how she interacts with Ryan. And she also has a history of substance abuse. So Ryan finds himself navigating volatile family relationships at times. And this poor little guy is trying to manage the adult outburst in the house by being the best he can be.
Yeah, I mean,
bless his little heart, right?
I know. And I mean, these are, always hard stories to hear because children are in these situations by no fault of their own.
Yeah.
Right. The idea that they think they're to blame or that they can somehow control the bad behaviors of the adults in their life is really difficult to hear, and it's just sad.
Yeah, agreed. And, luckily Ryan was appointed a CASA advocate around the same time that a relative was petitioning the court for custody of him. So life is definitely about to change, and we'll come back to that at the end of this episode.
Which I always look forward to. But so going back to a little bit of maybe digging further, I should say, into Ryan's story in ACEs, but the abuse and neglect that Ryan has been living with, so mental illness, substance use, volatile relationships, parent incarceration, these are all examples of what we mean and what we refer to when we say ACEs.
Right.
And really, I think what's really interesting to our staff at CASA is that this idea of identifying ACEs was a groundbreaking framework for understanding a little bit more clearly how early life experiences can then shape lifelong health.
Sure.
So what we've learned is that ACEs are potentially traumatic events that children might endure. So abuse, neglect, and then growing up in a household with dysfunctions like addiction or domestic violence, parental incarceration, things like that.
Yep. And this concept of ACEs kind of ties back to a study, I think it's been 30 years already, by the CDC and Kaiser Permanente. Researchers uncovered a powerful connection. It was kind of startling, honestly, at the time, that someone's ACE score, someone with a high ACE score, was more likely to have the risk of serious health and social problems later in life.
And so, listener, if you think, well, how do you get scored? The ACE score is based on a questionnaire. There's 10 questions, and it's a survey about an individual's childhood experiences, basically birth to 18. So there are questions like, did you live with anyone who was an alcoholic or who used drugs?
Yeah.
Was a member of your household depressed or mentally ill? Did someone in your family or household go to prison?
Yeah.
Right?
And so the more yeses to this list of questions, the higher someone's ACE score.
Yes. And as we said that the study sort of shockingly uncovered, the higher that ACE score, then the greater the risk. And it was a very clear correlation for future health and social problems later in life as adults.
Right. And what was and still is so very interesting is that it's not just behavioral health or social problems we're talking about here.
Right.
The correlation, does exist between a high ACE score and things like depression or anxiety, behaviors like smoking, substance abuse, risky relationships. But a higher ACEs score also correlates to a greater risk of physical health as well. And that's what is really interesting.
It's very interesting. And so what we know is that those high ACE scores are now directly linked to pretty significant chronic illnesses, such as heart disease, diabetes, cancer.
Yeah.
So neuroscience tells us that these experiences can rewire a child's brain, affecting their stress responses and their ability to regulate emotions.
Yeah, it's both fascinating and shocking, right? But the reason we're sharing this with you, listener, is that ACEs are preventable.
Right.
So the same data that shows us these correlations that feel kind of scary and overwhelming, that same data also tells us that when we intervene early to create stable, nurturing environments for kids, we can dramatically reduce these negative outcomes.
Yeah, I mean, that's resilience, right? So, imagine if we were able to cut down rates of addiction, heart disease, incarceration. I mean, those are major issues for our society. But we could simply do that by ensuring children grow up feeling safe and supported.
Yeah, that's amazing.
So it sounds very simple, but we also know it's very complicated.
Right.
Because, helping children be safe, knowing that they are safe and secure isn't necessarily a quick fix, but it is a long-term investment that can pay dividends.
Right. And we as court-appointed special advocates, we act as that safe adult who is making a child feel safe and supported. But ideally, they're getting that security and encouragement from many adults in their life.
Right. And so it's not just about one adult investing in one child's life. That's important.
Yeah.
But it's also about the higher level sort of systemic investments in mental health services, parenting support, other community-based programs.
Right. We have to look at it as an investment in children's lives, right? To improve a child's individual health, but also to improve the health of our entire future community.
Right. And when we know children have experienced ACEs, well, then in some ways that will allow us to be extra intentional.
Yeah.
And should be extra intentional about fostering healthier connections in order to reduce the risk of those negative outcomes that can be associated with ACEs.
Exactly. So let's talk about some ways that we can do that, right? The first, and we say this all the time, is to be a trusted adult in a child's life, right? Not just in word, but in deed. Let children know you're there to protect them, to support them. Use affirming language when you talk to them. Listen to them. Give them your full attention.
Exactly. I think any and all positive communication is generally good, right? And sort of tied into communicating, I would add that we should be modeling healthy emotional regulation for the children in our lives. And part of that is openly talking about feelings.
Right. And, honestly, depending on the age of a child, talking about feelings might have to start first with learning how to even name your emotions.
That's right. It's not quite as black and white of just mad or sad, or happy or sad.
Yeah.
We have to help them identify little more specific emotions. I'm feeling frustrated.
Yep.
I'm overwhelmed. I don't understand. I'm confused, right? Like a little more specific.
Right. And then after kind of naming an emotion, talking through healthy ways to cope and respond to that emotion. Maybe it's a breathing exercise or journaling or coloring.
Right. And I think regardless of the emotion or the tool that we try to teach, we should always do our best to stay calm.
Right.
We're the
Easier
adults.
said than done.
I know, we
Yeah.
are the adult. But, you know, if you need to take a time out, that's fine to gather yourselves, but it's to tap into patience.
Yeah.
Right? Don't let yourself get frustrated with a child's behavior, especially the children who have experienced potentially some really tough things in their young lives.
Right. And again, sometimes easier said than done. We know that. But if we're able to stay cool, calm, collected, then we're showing them a healthy way to handle challenging emotions.
Exactly. And so hopefully these recommendations around communicating and modeling healthy emotional regulation are ultimately helpful. But what we really need to do, I think, across the board is to recognize signs of stress that oftentimes can be trauma.
Yeah, so true. Because most of the time, you won't know that there are these adverse childhood experiencing happening in a child's home, right? It's not like we all walk around with our ACEs score on our foreheads, right?
Right. And if we did, it would certainly maybe be a little bit easier to pinpoint, you know, maybe individual children who need a little more assistance. But maybe we would treat one another with more empathy if we saw those high scores, because we would understand that it, you know, would translate to life challenges that people are navigating every day.
Yeah, it's like that saying, you never really know what someone else is going through, right?
You don't know what you don't know.
Yep.
And I think knowing what we don't know, or who has experienced how many and what type of ACEs, you know, we have to then be observant.
Right.
So we're watching children for signs of stress. Maybe it's a change in behavior, altered sleep patterns, just like significant moodiness that's different.
Yeah, and we can watch for signs of neglect too, you know. Maybe it's kids sneaking food, kids who are underdressed for the weather, kids falling asleep in class.
And, you know, those are a little more subtle. And then there's the unfortunate, really clear signs of abuse: bruises, limps, consistent excuses for injuries that don't really match or make sense, you know, things like that.
Yeah. You know, we call ourselves vigilant voices for children, but to be a vigilant voice, we must first be observant, right? And Ryan, from our CASA case story, Ryan's advocate was very observant. Ryan was of the just fine mindset. You know, he wasn't yet comfortable opening up to his advocate, but she watched and she listened. She saw signs of struggle at school and proactively got him academic help. She saw signs of him grieving, and so she connected him with a counselor. She saw that he responded in fear when he was interacting with his birth mom, so she recommended that the family have a safety plan.
And I mean, I think these are all great examples as to why it's so important, and I'm so glad that Ryan had this advocate. It's a great example of an advocate being a child's voice.
Yeah.
Right? So Ryan wasn't necessarily comfortable voicing his own needs, or at least speaking them out loud.
Sure.
But due to her consistency, this advocate observed, responded, and then started connecting him and the family with resources that maybe they didn't even know they needed.
Yeah, and Ryan is definitely on a better path. He lives in calm now, and his basic needs are being met. We're hopeful that the more secure he feels, the more he'll be able to cope with and communicate his emotions.
And I love that, and it reminds me of something that I wanted to be sure to say on this episode, but I think the whole concept of ACEs can be frightening. You know, like if a child has a high number of adverse experiences, they're doomed for life.
It feels like that. Yeah, when you see the charts and the graphs, it's overwhelming.
Right. But it's just not true. So yes, we know that it is true that science shows that the higher number of ACEs, the more likely that there can and will be certain negative health outcomes. But the same science shows that we can mitigate the effects of ACEs by creating supportive, nurturing environments for children.
Yeah, and that's why we have this podcast and talk about these tough issues, right? We want to help children overcome adversity. Every interaction we have with a child is an opportunity to do that and to make a difference.
Right, and this is the same for you, listeners. You know, you are now an adult, but hey, we know that you may have experienced your own adverse childhood experiences that impact your life today. that's okay. But we hope that hearing a bit about ACEs helps you understand how your past trauma during childhood may be impacting your well-being today.
Yeah. And so our call to action today is to use the link in our show notes to review the ACEs questionnaire. You can take time to reflect on it and maybe even calculate what your ACE score is.
Yeah. And, it may be lower than you thought or higher than you thought, but either way, please know that it doesn't dictate your future.
Right.
It doesn't calculate the impact of having a stable adult in your life, which we know mitigates the impact of ACEs and helps to build that resilience.
Right. Think of the ACEs questionnaire as just a tool
Right.
for better understanding yourself, your health, your behaviors, your emotions.
Because the more you know, the more that you can grow.
Thank you for listening to Vigilant Voices, Henrico Casas' podcast. We have a vision for all children to live in safe, healthy homes. You can help us make that happen. Tell a friend about our podcast and find us on social media.
I believe in the better days.